This next set of images is amongst the most evocative from the 1980s. They show the work's main entrance on Rodbourne Road. For almost 150 years, this was the scene repeated every day, 6 days a week, as the men streamed out after the works hooter had sounded. 31 years later, no trace of where the main gates once stood. They were further back from the main road, allowing lorries to turn into the entrance. Many years ago, the trams provided a form of transport for the men inside, as it was known. Later, there were buses, but throughout, it was the bicycle that remained the main form of transport. People still streamed from one side to the other of Rodbourne Road, but now it's for a very different reason. The land where the entrance once stood is now a car park for the outlet shopping centre. No longer do you encounter crowds of railwaymen with oily boiler suits and blackened faces and hands. It's pristine shoppers with bags of designer labels. Whilst we're in Rodbourne Road, here's the sign for the main entrance seen in 1985. You could say its tired and peeling paint was a sign of the times and a sign of things to come. This was taken on the day that the closure was announced. Today, the wall and the railings, and indeed the sign, have gone, as the entrance was demolished and swept away when the car park was constructed in 1996. That day in early 1985, when closure was announced, was a shock for the rail workers, who through their families had been employed for generations. They had an enviable reputation for quality, and Swindon products were respected around the world. Swindon Cable reported from the entrance of the works on that day as staff read the headlines in the local paper. The headline said it all, quite simply, doomed. At the time, the whole town went into shock as everyone tried to come to terms with the reality that Swindon's once proud association with the railways was finally about to end. This is the same spot where that shocked railwayman once stood back in 1985. This unusual view was taken in the mid-1980s from one of the work's traversers in the mighty A-shop. This used to be the biggest covered workshop in Europe and was constructed in 1902. The traverser was used for carrying whole locomotives up and down the bays in which building or repairs could be carried out. Our view shows a variety of the early diesel locomotive fleets under repair, passenger and shunting engines, cranes and bogies, a true Aladdin's cave for the railway enthusiast. We may never know the true identity of Ginger and Bill, whose names have been painted on the side of the traverser. These images are well known to locomotive enthusiasts. Swindon was almost hallowed ground. But today, the same location over 30 years later, heavy industry replaced by housing. Incredible to think that once upon a time, some of this country's smartest, fastest and most iconic steam engines and diesels were built just here, where rows of new houses and flats now stand. The air is silent, no longer the growl of the traverser, or hammers sounding metal upon metal, or the workers shouting above the noise of the workshop in everyday use. Here's another view from inside the mighty A-shop, and shows a Class 08 diesel shunter, or Gronk to use their nickname, being moved around. Once the glamorous work of building the copper-capped King's, Castles and Hall steam locomotives was over, and later the diesel hydraulics for British Rail, Swindon settled down to major repairs and overhauls. This small shunting engine could be found all over the country, and many of them were looked after by Swindon. Again, today's view over 30 years later shows that the works really are a distant memory. There are few clues as to the site's rich heritage. But look carefully enough and there are signs. In one of the gardens of the new housing blocks is a pair of driving wheels from one of those gronks. Who knows, this could be a pair of the very same wheels that we saw under the shunter on the Traverser back in the 1980s. This view from the 1980s shows the Asbestos removal shop. This is where the dangerous material was removed from carriages and locomotives. It had been used to insulate against noise and heat. Many Swindon men later contracted the dreaded mesothelioma, which became known as the Swindon disease, a form of cancer caused by coming into contact with asbestos. Outside the building, there are rows of redundant bogies and wheels, removed from vehicles that had already been scrapped. One of British Rail's blue and grey high-speed trains speeds by. The view today, 30 years later, has no reference point to the past. Even the main railway line is hidden, just behind the trees. To the left of this view are the houses built where once the large A-shop stood. In our 1980s view, we see the cutter using his blowtorch to reduce a Class 40 locomotive to a pile of scrap metal. The location is near the end of what was the weighbridge. As well as building and repairing locomotives, the Railway Works was also responsible for scrapping and cutting up hundreds of engines, carriages and wagons. An area off the bottom of Wootton Bassett Road was known as the dump, where scrapping took place. Today, the building still survives and is known as the Weighbridge Restaurant. Watch the apex roof to the left. The scrap, endless railway lines and even the workers, all gone. Peace has returned to this area of town, the industrial character completely swept away in the modern Swindon. This is the other end of the weighbridge, and if once again we watch the roof, we can catch it in our view from 30 years ago, when the area looks so different. Back to the mid-1980s, and we're looking down towards the pattern store and the main workshops at Swindon. In the foreground is the main railway line, followed by a collection of rolling stock in for repair or scrapping. By this time, Swindon Works was no longer involved in building new engines and carriages. Keep an eye on the signal gantry. Over the railway, 31 years later, and the same view. The pattern store still stands, of course, but blocked out now by the trees. However, the mighty A-shop and ancillary buildings, now all gone. Even this diesel locomotive and all the wagons forming this freight train have all visited the scrap man. Only the signal gantry remains. In this 1985 view, we're peering through the east gates of the works on Rodbourne Road, opposite what used to be Art Dean's motorcycle shop. The buildings in view were once the tank shop to the left and the boiler shop to the right. In the distance we see a crane parked where the Traverser once moved up and down the rails. The view from the same spot 31 years later is completely obstructed. This is now part of the Great Western Designer Outlet. Where the crane stood is now a children's playground. This area has been covered over to protect shoppers from the elements. These are the same steel gates we saw in the 1980s, although now they have steel plates for extra security. Over the years, BR Blue's been replaced by black. Another perspective looking in the same direction. In the original view in the distance is the North Star College. However, the area in between now houses the National Trust's Healis building and an extension to the works' main offices for English heritage. Pedestrians used to have a tantalising view inside the works as they walked past. The area, now undercover, forms part of the transformation when this part of the works became the outlet shopping village, opened in 1997.